Our next session is chaired by Alison Norrington, the CEO of Story Central.
Thank you. It works. Hi everybody. Thank you for joining us in a session when you're possibly already hungry, as it's 12:30. We have an interesting conversation here, classic stories for a new generation. I'd like to tell you first of all that you can ask questions via my iPad. So if you look at the URL up on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, glsr, glsr.it/BVE18, that's the best way for you to ask questions because we don't have a roaming mic. So I was actually told they would filter out the inappropriate questions, but I told them not to do that because I want to know who's in the room saying bad stuff. But I possibly won't read them out. So I'd like to introduce, of course, Suzanne Mackie.
Hello.
Hello. Who is the exec producer, of course, of The Crown, The Replacements, and is also working on the scripted YouTube series Origin. Hi, Suzanne.
Hello.
And I'd also like to introduce Mark Everson, the editor of Paddington 1 and 2.
Hi.
So now we know the mics are working. Okay, so I'll leave this here. If any questions pop up, I'm happy to ask them as we go through. So, of course, this session, classic stories, and I'm really interested to speak to both Suzanne and Mark about how to take these legacy stories and tell them for a modern audience. So, of course, there's a lot of attention deficit going on right now. Everybody's like looking at 2-minute cat videos on YouTube. So how to take these huge stories and tell them to an audience that actually hold their attention. Both of Suzanne and Mark come to this from quite a different perspective. Suzanne from a producer point of view, who's producing this high-end drama that spans a story of like maybe 50 years or more. And then Mark, who works as an editor to maintain the vision or edit what is shot to ensure that there's a consistent and coherent storyline. So my first question is to you, Suzanne. How did you come to work on The Crown, and how did you feel about taking on such a huge legacy story?
So I came to The Crown. The company I work for, Left Bank Pictures, really produced television and feature films. My boss, the CEO of Left Bank Pictures, is Andy Harris, and he and Peter Morgan have worked together over many, many years, almost their entire careers, I'd say. And so they worked on The Deal together, and they worked on The Queen, the feature film. And Andy was involved in A Special Relationship, and so their interest in storytelling, I suppose, is many ways about modern politics and obviously the monarchy, I suppose, because of the Queen. And so Andy and Peter Morgan worked on a play, which was unusual because we don't get involved in the theatre much as we love it and attend it. We don't make theatre, but Andy worked on The Audience, which Peter Morgan wrote and Stephen Daldry directed in the West End with Helen Mirren. And this was a real departure for Andy to work in the theatre, but we were all very interested in it, and out of that came the idea for The Crown, partly because Peter was really interested in the relationship between the young Queen, or as she was then, the Princess, before she became the Queen, and then her relationship with Churchill, who was at the end of his reign, and she was at the beginning of hers, and what that relationship might be like, and that piqued his interest as a dramatist, and out of that we encouraged him to write more, that this was a bigger story than just that. But that was the genesis of it, and Andy and Peter have known each other for so many years, like lots of creative collaborators. It's a complex relationship, and it's a big one. And Andy realised very quickly that this was going to be a big project, The Crown, and we got commissioned by Netflix for 2 seasons, which is very unusual. So that's 20 hours. That's a big, big undertaking for a production company. And Andy felt it needed a grown-up, in his words, to sort of work on The Crown with Peter, and in many ways become Peter's producer, and that's what I am. That's what I've become. And when asked, I mean, it was a very easy, straightforward yes. I was working at the company anyway, had been for many years, Peter Morgan is someone I admire enormously, and I thought it was a fascinating subject matter. I also loved the idea of working with Stephen Daldry, who I still think is probably one of the great directors in our country. And I just thought, wow, what an extraordinary opportunity. And Peter writes, you know, there's no one else, I think, in the country that can write with such confidence and such insight and wisdom as Peter Morgan, writing about, you know, really what is Great Britain, the second half of the 20th century, right through to, it'll be right through to today if we achieve our ambition. Yeah, it's a bit of a privilege for me, to be honest.
It's quite an amazing task to take on, isn't it?
Yeah, huge.
So Mark, how did you start to work on Paddington?
Well, I guess it really came from my relationship with Paul King, because I worked on the Mighty Boosh and cut everything that Paul did, so it was kind of a natural progression, really. But yeah, what you said earlier, that my job is to edit what's shot on location, doesn't quite... because also I have to edit what is animated afterwards, so like a big part of Paddington is developing his performance. It's quite tough because there's nothing there. There's no motion capture. There's literally a stick with a ping pong ball on, and from that you have to develop some physical comedy or emotional performance. Yeah.
So you have to have quite a clear vision of the final outcome, the final product, right?
No, not really, because I think we do so in a normal script you've got stage direction, dialogue, and that's about it, really, and an actor brings so much to it, and you realise how much an actor brings when you're faced with just a blank plate to put a bear in.
Yeah.
And when you're cutting it, really, in the early stages, you cut a receptacle for this performance to go in, and you're saying, well, you know, when does he look up? When does he touch this? What's he doing here? And also you can pitch new lines of dialogue, you know, is this scene funny enough? How can we come up with a joke based upon the shots we have?
Yeah, right.
So there's a blueprint, but so much is undecided.
Yeah.
And of course, you reach a point where you can have pickups. On Paddington 1 and 2, we had about 3 weeks of pickup shooting, and then you'll have a wish list of scenes you haven't got or things you really need. And I think on the recent Paddington, the opening scene it opens with Aunt Lucy and Uncle Pastuzo, and there's a big dramatic sequence. But yeah, that wasn't in the original script, and we came up with that about 6 months in. So yeah, there's not a completely nailed down vision, I'd say. Yeah.
Which I know ties into how things work with you, Suzanne, in terms of you and Peter sit and look together to see if there's a beat missing or something didn't come across as you'd intended. How do you work around that?
So yeah, I mean, Peter would always say he feels he writes the scripts and then he writes the scripts again when he's in the edit in post, which is probably overstating it slightly, but I know what he means. I think, as Mark said, you know, that you can have a sort of a vision for an episode or a story, and then actually something else occurs to you when you're in post-production. It's not either quite doing what it's supposed to be doing, or the structure of it might not be working quite as coherently as you hoped it might. And often things are just simply missing. The story's just not coming through, or you realise, I mean, on season 1 of The Crown, we write, I mean, having worked on the scripts for over a year, when we were with the sort of Margaret and Peter Townsend storyline in episode 10, so that's quite a hefty way through both the development and then the shooting of a season. We were in post for episode 10, right at the very end, and we thought, you know what, this was sort of, we've got this wrong. We've got this fundamentally wrong. Margaret and Peter Townsend should be broken-hearted about losing each other, and somehow we've made it way too casual. It feels like they're just giving each other up very easily. And whether that's true or not historically, one has an obligation to make something work dramatically. And so we looked deep into ourselves and thought, this isn't doing what it should do. So we went back and reshot it at, I have to say, at some expense. And those decisions are never taken lightly, casually. They're taken very heavily. And but the end result was that we had a much more moving, more emotionally engaging story and ending to that particular story strand. And everyone in the end thanked us, both the actors, Netflix, I suspect the audience. And that's what you have to do. In the end, our obligation, our responsibility is to the story, to the project, and to telling it as best as you possibly can. And sometimes you have to take very difficult decisions. But that reshoot would have cost us a lot of money, which would have come out of the pocket of something else. It doesn't just miraculously arrive through thin air, and that's the job of a producer and the job of a writer and the job of an editor and director. You come together and what's the best story?
So there's two kind of ways I look at that. There's one part of it which is when you said when Margaret and Peter split and you felt like the heartbreak didn't come through. And of course, like you say, we don't know whether there was this huge heartbreak or not, but for the purpose of storytelling, you really amplified that emotion. So that's sort of you guys with creative license, right, to make that more of a pivotal, huge moment that the audience feel it. So that's storytelling. But then you've got the other flip side of that, which is, I know that you've worked with researchers to pull out really true elements. And one of the questions that came in is, how do you deal with historical critics who look for mistakes and historical errors? But I suppose probably that is a blend between working with researchers, so you've got that red line all the way through, but then where do you decide to be more creative with the story?
No, it's a good question. Well, the truth is we spend hours and hours and hours and hours every day, and I absolutely don't exaggerate when I say 7 days a week, all year round. It really is. Huddled together with very brilliant historians and young, not so young, graduates and people, researchers basically. We've got a team of about 10 researchers, and they're all brilliant and dedicated, but what they're very good at is spotting a fact and then feeding it to Peter Morgan and knowing that that fact might be feeding his imagination. Because you can, when you're telling a historical drama, The Crown, you have to be very careful that you're not hitting every historical moment. Otherwise, we're just doing that was the week that was sort of thing, and that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to capture a moment in our recent history, and shot through the prism of our monarch. We're telling the story of in many ways Great Britain and a socio-political changing landscape. But we generally, I can honestly say, most of our fact-checking is incredibly rigorous, and now and again we have to depart from fact, and Peter would say rather grandly, he's looking for truth, not necessarily accuracy, and I completely subscribe to that. I think that's absolutely right. Otherwise, let's make a documentary. That's not what we are. But I can hand on heart say that most of what we do is fact-checked and accurate. And there are now and again historians that have pulled us up, one in particular, who, now and again you get it wrong, but actually most of the time you get it right.
Yeah. And I think for me at least, like to see the Queen as a young woman, and I don't know about anybody else, but it completely changed my perception. I've only ever known her as an old lady, right? And to see her as a young woman and to see that journey, I mean, I'm not a great historian, but there would be parts that I feel would be excused for that up-close storytelling that you've done with her.
Yeah, and Peter can't imagine what Prince Philip and the Queen may have said in their bedroom. I mean, how on earth could he possibly know that? But we can imagine because we are, dare I say it, intelligent, sensitive, emotionally aware human beings, storytellers, that can imagine if that had just happened, that is probably how you'd feel.
Yeah, brilliant.
And that's the basis of how we then would construct a scene.
But that's a good storyteller as well, right? So Mark, in terms of you, Paddington's gone from like book to comic to cartoon to now blockbuster film. Have you had any critics along the way in terms of the transition of the Paddington story?
Well, strangely, well, no. I mean, Paddington 2 is, I think it's still 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. So critically,
Oh, really?
it's a record-breaking amount of good reviews.
Brilliant.
So,
Wow.
yeah, people seem to be quite unoffended. But to be honest, I think before it came out, you did feel like the knives were out. People were already
Oh, really?
preparing themselves to be furious about it, and it came out, and I think everyone was relieved that it hadn't been ruined. So actually, I think it's gone okay.
Okay, I've got some questions that have come in for Paddington. On Paddington 1 and 2, did you work with storyboards at all to block out Paddington in each shot and scene? If so, was this before or after you started shooting?
Yeah, before shooting and afterwards, because sometimes you will. We talked earlier about pickups, and quite often you'll have an idea for a scene, and you'll just get some storyboards made and do a little radio play. So within the cut, you'll have. And sometimes those scenes then go away. You know, there's ideas we've had for scenes, and you storyboard them, put them into a cut where you've got live action, and then on reflection, you know, you try it out,
Yeah.
and then you get rid of them sometimes. But then we also have post-viz and pre-viz, which is a kind of, you know, it looks a bit like a computer game, and you can map out an action. Generally, we do that with action sequences, so you've got some material to work with before you get the plates, or, you know, before you shoot the material without the bearing.
Okay, cool. Some questions on the crown. Has the Queen commented about anything on the crown?
No, I mean, no.
Okay.
One hears anecdotal stories of other members of the royal household watching it, and we always wince, and, you know.
She must
I-
watch it.
Yeah,
She
she's
must
got to
do.
watch it.
Well, do you think she's got Netflix? I don't know.
yeah, definitely.
I no idea. I mean, again, rather, to be honest, we had to take the view very early on that, you know, the less we're in their lives and the less they're in our lives, the probably mutually better for both. You know, it's complicated otherwise. You can't get too close. Otherwise, you inhibit it, really.
Another question about the crown. Are there any legal issues or slander regarding filming the crown?
Well, yeah, again, that's a good question. I mean, we have lawyers poring over the scripts, and right from the beginning, yeah, you have to observe things very sensitively and carefully. And once you've really got the sign-off from lawyers at the script stage, then obviously they'll look at it again when it's in post-production, when it's filmed. And I think we took the decision to take out a couple of things that might have been a bit gratuitously misleading and not saying what we meant it to say. And you know, and we don't want to get involved in anything that's damaging or salacious, or that's not our style. But yes, things have to be looked at very carefully by lawyers.
Okay, I have a question about budget for the crown and also for Paddington. I don't know whether that's something you can speak at.
Yeah. Well, our budget has been sort of exaggerated hugely. I think most people thought when we got a very good budget, definitely, but it's nowhere near as big as the press picked up on. So that's always been slightly frustrating to us, because I think, you know, we're odd. We don't like people having big budgets. We're not big Hollywood, you know. So we've tried to downplay that. Actually, to be honest, it's sort of been massively misquoted. What we got was for 2 seasons, not for 1. Anyway, it's fine. It's a good budget.
Cool. Anything you can say?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a bit complicated because then you get tax breaks and various things. I think Paddington 2, we had a bit more. I don't know. It's like 50, 60, 70 million.
So not much,
I'm
really.
not sure. Yeah, you know, a bit.
It's more than us.
Yeah.
Okay, so interesting question here. Why are you changing the cast for The Crown?
Because we can't have them age 20 years per 2 seasons. It just that you'd start looking at Claire Foy and going, she's not 70. I mean, you know, she's a young in her early 30s. Similarly, Matt Smith. It's just I think it becomes a distraction that is unwelcome. We took the view way before we cast Matt and Claire that we pledged to change our cast every 20 seasons, and we are sticking to that. And as we started filming season 1 and season 2, of course you inevitably then think your cast is your cast, and how can you possibly change them? And none of us want to in many ways, because they're so brilliant and lovely and they've become friends. But at the same time, our next season 3 and 4, we take them through 1960 right through to the end of Margaret Thatcher's reign. We couldn't possibly have Claire and Matt play that sort of age. I just don't think it. And I think it's interesting to change cast. You know, I think it's a new challenge. The Crown endlessly, for me as a producer, presents new and interesting challenges, whether that's working for someone like Netflix and having all your episodes available in one fell swoop right across however many territories across the world. That's an incredibly exciting new way of making programs, and you know, I think it's really exciting to embrace that change. And similarly, to then say on top of that, we're also going to change our cast every 20 episodes. I think that's really exciting. We're not doing it to be clever, but we are trying to do it for sensible artistic reasons. And then you embrace it and go with it, and it's a new challenge. And I hope we get it right.
Which is a problem you don't have, because your cast doesn't age, right?
Oh, the humans do. Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen.
So how would you approach, say, the Paddington character, though? Because it's like The Simpsons or any of these characters that never age, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's the one problem you don't have with Paddington. Yeah, I guess the tonally deciding what is right for Paddington. We had some suggestions of jokes from some various parties loosely involved in the production, and yeah, you just had to make calls. I mean, there were some jokes you just thought, I don't think Paddington farts a lot. And just tonal thing, you know what I mean? You've just got to keep it in the zone. Keep it Paddingtonian is what we would say. You'd think that doesn't seem Paddingtonian.
I love it.
So yeah, I guess that's the challenge.
So your story arcs are different, aren't they? They're almost like repeat. Like you have a series of different scenarios that Paddington would be in.
Yeah, although we try and keep it quite tightly. Do you know what I mean? The scenarios aren't quite just comic set pieces for the sake of it. Although arguably in Paddington 2, the barbershop scene didn't have a lot of impact. But yeah, you try and keep everything pushing the story forward and keep it. I mean, we actually try and keep it very tight in story terms.
Yes.
I mean, we're very tough on those things. We don't just sort of stop for a joke just for the hell of it. Hopefully the jokes can feed in and push the story forward.
Yeah, nice. And in terms of pushing the story forward, for what you're doing, Suzanne, you have this great way when we're watching The Crown of zipping through months or maybe years, but zipping through months, and yet we have places where like time stands still, right? So like I love the fog episode, and I know we did kind of talk about that earlier, but how do you choose those moments? How do you work with researchers for those moments? And how do you get a sense that people don't feel rushed when you're zipping through time, and yet enjoy like the intimacy of the time standing still parts?
I think. Well, it's interesting. I mean, having a canvas of 20 hours or 10 hours per season gives you a huge opportunity of taking your time, storytelling terms, I mean, Peter always said in season 1 he could have written another 10 episodes and only got through half of the 10 years, if per season it's putatively 10 years. And you have to make careful choices. Again, you don't want to hit every beat, every historical moment too obviously. I think there's a more elegant way of telling stories. And I mean, something like the fog episode, that weirdly, I think that was Stephen Daldry had told Peter about that, and that it had lit up his imagination, and because it was a great way of telling, in many ways, Churchill's story, or Churchill post-Attlee, and so it just immediately gives you a bigger, it's in many ways a metaphor for a bigger story.
Yeah.
But I think, I mean, Peter Morgan is also a playwright, and so when you read his scenes, they're often big, they are text-driven, they're often one-on-one, whether it's Frost Nixon or the Queen. He likes capturing a moment and a moment between two people, and that's what he does brilliantly. So we're always thrilled when we have 10 pages of dialogue, and sometimes in the past from a writer that would slightly worry me, but with Peter I think we all admire there's a boldness and there's a muscularity to his writing and a sophistication to his writing that really keeps you hooked in. And actually I love television that takes its time and isn't afraid to have big dialogue scenes if it's interesting and if the actors are great and if actually what you're learning from it is something, whether it's an emotional moment or a political one. But so I suppose, it's a combination of telling the story of the Queen's reign and allowing Peter to tell it in his own inimitable way,
Which he does so well. Oh, hello. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions here for you, Mark. You're going to love this one. What is the most misunderstood part of your job as an editor?
The whole part of it? Yeah, I think most people just have no idea what it involves. I think because you see, everyone sees the finished product, and it's hard to imagine it being any other way. And it is for me as well. After sort of a year of cutting Paddington, you look at it and you think, well, I can't imagine it any other way now. But to get there is a lot of experimentation, development. It just takes a long while, especially with Paddington, because developing it, every sequence we've spent at least 3 months developing the bear's performance and reviews with animators who you sort of feed back to them. I guess people don't realise that on an animated film how closely you're involved with the development of the character, but also that you're influenced upon the story and asking for pickups, etc. I think people think you get a script and then they shoot it and then you put it together like the script and then that's it.
Well, that ties nicely into another question for you, which is how early do you and your team start working on Paddington?
Well, I think our VFX editor started 6 months before the shoot, because we were editing storyboards together. I mean, you edit these sort of animatic storyboards together with music just to get a feel for it, and Paul have redesigned scenes based around it, and developed sequences with pre-visualization in it. And there's some sequences that are almost completely CG, so you have those pre-realized. And then, to be honest, the rest of the team starts on day one of the shoot.
And how many on your team?
There was me. I co-edited Paddington 2 with John Amos, who just won a BAFTA for Baby Driver. He's probably going to win an Oscar. And because it was just me on the first one, and I didn't get enough weekends off or sleep. So a visual effects editor, assistant visual effects editor, a third assistant visual effects editor sometimes, a trainee assistant editor, first assistant editor.
Nice, quite a team.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple of questions for Suzanne. I don't know how you can answer this one really, but let's go for it. What is the relationship like with Netflix?
Oh, really good, honestly. Yeah, they're really great. And you know, when we started The Crown 5 years ago, I think it was 5 years ago, you know, Netflix wasn't quite what it is now. You know, it's grown hugely, exponentially over 5 years. It's you know, everyone, many people have now heard of Netflix, and maybe 5 years ago, not so. So we felt we were joining something that, I mean, you know, it had House of Cards, but it didn't have quite the huge profile it has now. So it felt like we were being adventurous to an extent. As I said earlier, it felt exciting to be part of something new. It was pitched around America to, you know, all the obvious big, you know, companies that you can imagine, like HBO and Showtime and FX and so on and so forth. And actually, when it was taken to Netflix at the end of the first week of pitching, Peter and Stephen Daldry had kind of honed their pitch very well by then, just as you do, you know, you just do. And at the end of it, Ted Sarandos and the team looked at each other and just said, yeah, we'll have that, we'll have it. And that, you know, so that for a producer is an amazing thing, to come out of a room and know that you've probably just landed 20 hours of television is you know, that gives a lot of people a lot of employment. You know, it's good. It's really good. And that incredible confidence was, I think, testament to where Netflix was positioning themselves at that time, where they planned to go. We didn't know they were about to launch absolutely globally, and that The Crown was going to be part of that launch, part of that next big stage for them. And so we talk to them every week. We see them a lot. They come over here, we go over there. We involve them at every step of the way. They're great. They don't breathe down our necks. We get on with it. They let us get on with it, and we've done okay for them. And you know, they've been good to us. So
That's
no,
great.
it's good.
So we've been asked whether you've pitched any other ideas to Netflix,
Yes.
and what is the process?
Well, they get inundated, as you can imagine. So, I mean, we've sent them things since The Crown, and it hasn't been right. And we've sent, yeah, I mean, we've possibly got another project with them, but it's very, very early days. But yeah, they, you know, they are. Curiously, they're a big company of big ambitions, but actually, there are very few people there that would be the recipient of ideas. So. I think they're expanding quite quickly, but yeah, I mean, like anything, you know, it's just that single idea that they can't resist. And often you've got to put a package in place, so it's not just an idea that you're taking to them. You're taking, I mean, you know, the Crown was not only territory that clearly they thought would travel and sell around the world very easily, which, let's face it, they were right about, but I think probably what really was the alluring package for them was the subject matter written by Peter Morgan, to be directed by Stephen Daldry. And I think if I'd been them, I would have absolutely said yes to it, because that's some package, to be honest.
Of course.
You know.
And you talk about 20 episodes, which is 2 seasons. So is that the deal, that you're selling in 2 seasons at a time?
It has been so far, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is it going to go all the way through to the end?
Well, that's the ambition. Yeah, you can never say. I mean, we'd never dare sit back on our laurels and think, yeah, well, that's us tied up for the next 5 years making The Crown, because you just don't know. I hope so.
And another question, how do you choose your other directors for The Crown?
Well, so far, I mean, a lot of the team that we made season 1 and season 2 have come back, which is fantastic. And so you know, I mean, it's a big, the pressure of the show is huge, not least on Peter Morgan. So to keep a tight team around him that's been there from the beginning is really important. But you know, I also think it's important to replenish and to promote and to allow people that were assistants in one season to become whatever it is in the next. And I think that's really important. You know, I think it's really important to start nurturing the next generation behind everyone else, and we do that. To be honest, we sort of have to do that because you have to train people up, because otherwise there's just not enough good people in the industry generally. But the directors, I mean, you know, it's a tough ask, because the Crown is now established in a particular thing. It's very much Peter's vision to an extent, and the directors that come on board will enhance that. So we take a lot of time thinking about who the directors are. They've got to be the right personality fit. They've got to love the material. They've got to work in a team thing. There's a little bit of cross-boarding. In the past we have had double banking that goes on, so we're shooting two episodes at the same time. So we have 2 film units in 2 different parts of the country. And that is huge, and it's a real headache, but sometimes that's the only way to do it. And you know, so there's a lot, you know, we need great people, to be honest, but that doesn't mean that you have to be established to be great. We had someone right from beginning of season 1 who was really new, and it felt quite risky, and it was like a great risk to take, and it's paid off brilliantly because he's one of our best directors. But you know, you have to be sure, because it's a big risk otherwise.
Yeah, of course.
You only get one chance at these things. You can't go back and reshoot a whole episode.
No, but you do reshoot some episodes.
Yeah, of course, but not very, very. It has to be very considered. You know, we would never go back to Netflix and say, "Oh, we got that wrong. Can we just have a bit more money, please?" I mean, the money comes from us. Yeah. If we have to make a decision, that comes out of our budget. We don't go back to Netflix. You know, Netflix just want us to deliver the best.
Yeah.
And so that's why I said you don't take these decisions lightly. But at the same time, you know, when you're only 10% away from being excellent, you've got to do it, haven't you?
Yeah,
otherwise.
So in terms of such a huge mythology of that story, you know, you've got this like through line that is the story arc that you take all the way through to the end. But how do you make sure that you keep canon? Like, how do you make sure you're not discarding parts that are integral to that huge story? When you've got so much there, how do you decide what to keep and what to get rid of in terms of mapping before you even script or shoot anything?
Peter works out the architecture of the whole 2 seasons right at the beginning. So I know, and I'm almost certainly not allowed to say what happens in season 4, but I know absolutely every episode of season 3 and season 4 back to front. I know exactly. But you know, if I said to you, look, we're going to depict the Wilson years in season 3 up to Wilson's resignation in episode 10, then everyone knows roughly what happened in those 10 years or 12 years, whatever it is. Similarly, if I say we start season 4 with Margaret Thatcher, you can kind of roughly work out, oh, okay, that's going to be those years. But you can't tell everything. And, you know, so for season 2, we knew we would have to meet the Kennedys at some point. But actually what was much more interesting for Peter and for us was that the Queen should meet Jackie Kennedy rather than the Queen should meet JFK. That's suddenly more interesting to First Ladies, if you like. And you know, I know Peter has ideas for the next 2 seasons that I hope are going to be surprising and interesting and fresh, because you know you want to keep things fresh and you want to keep things on their feet and being interested and maybe coming at stories that coming at a story from a different angle is interesting. Otherwise, again, we may as well just be telling a documentary, in a documentary style, and that's not what we are. I mean, I love documentaries, but that's not what we do.
No, that's right. And I think the fact that it's not a documentary adds that emotion in there, like those moments that you've chosen to tell with like an artistic license, rather than just a recount of history.
Yeah, exactly.
So for you, Mark, in terms of Paddington, is there any talk of a Paddington 3? Like, where's it going for you guys?
There is talk of a Paddington 3. I've noticed it on IMDb.
Okay.
But there's no story I mean, I think there's always ideas floating around. I think the idea for Paddington 2, Paul was knocking around. By the end of 1, we sort of, you know, there was an idea that Paddington would go to prison. So there's some things knocking around, but there's nothing's solid. So I don't know. It's just, I think Paddington 1 did very well. Everyone seems to think Paddington 2 was a step up, and I think everyone's just a bit worried about having to follow number 2, because it turned out very well.
So what are you working on now?
I'm working with Rowan Atkinson
fun.
on Johnny English 3.
Oh,
so
excellent.
yeah, he's a big hero, and he's very nice, which is good news.
Even better.
Yeah.
Only work with nice people.
Yeah, he's
right?
lovely. He's really nice.
That sounds fun. Another question then for Suzanne. How much say does the director have in the casting?
Oh, massive. I mean, we would never. No single person makes a decision on the crown. I mean, sometimes you have to, in the end. Trying to think whether there's ever been an occasion where everyone feels one way and one person feels strongly the other, and they have the casting vote. I think we all tend to listen to each other. You tend to arrive at things fairly easily. I mean, with the casting of Claire Foy, I mean, we took one look at her tape, as it were, her audition tape, and we all just went, oh God, come on, yeah, brilliant, amazing. Season 3 is inevitably the new casting it's challenging because they're a generation older, and so inevitably, therefore, they're probably well known, or they're going to be probably more likely to be well known, and then so people then become a bit more passionate about who or why or. But we have a very, very good casting director in Nina Gold, probably one of the best, and she is very good at guiding us. But we've only actually cast one, the Queen, and no one else. And there have been a few kind of moments of disagreement, and that's healthy, I think. I think that's inevitable. The stakes feel high, and you want to get it right, and people have very passionate opinions.
Yes. And you're right, as the cast is older, they're more well-known cast, and people have more of an opinion, I suppose, about what's right. Okay, so we do need to finish, but I do have a final question that's come in that I don't know whether you have an answer to, but for both of you, is there a classic story that you would really like to get your hands on to tell? And if the answer to that is, I haven't thought about it because I'm too busy, there's another, which is, do you have a favourite genre of classic stories to produce?
No, actually, because I think I've sort of, whether it's The Crown or The Replacement or Mad Dogs, it's usually just a good story. I suppose I couldn't, if someone offered me a horror, I wouldn't know what to do with that, or a sort of male macho action show. We make Strike Back, and if Andy ever asked me to go and produce that, I think I'd have to. I'd rather produce something like Paddington than Strike Back, but we do it very well. But it's just, you can't. I don't know what I'd bring to it.
Okay.
So I suppose truthful, real stories.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. And I can see a pattern: Paddington, Rowan Atkinson.
Well, yeah, I mean, in a sense, there's a sort of technical typecasting. I like doing comedy, and it seems to be going okay. But yeah, I would like to do a variety of things. But equally, I mean, to be honest, as an editor, you're quite reactive rather than proactive. You see what comes your way, and we'll see what comes my way.
Certainly will. We're out of time. I'd like to thank all of you for your questions. There's some really good ones in there. But I'd also like to thank Suzanne and Mark for just taking this time to speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you.